in any of the Latin American countries at 85%. The three principal commercial banks that are foreign controlled in Mexico now are, one is by the Spanish giant BBVA, and owns Bancomer. Citibank is owned by Banamex, and then the other Spanish giant, Santander Fin, is the third largest. Scotiabank is another major player, and the lone domestic bank that's left is Banorte, that's of any major size at the current moment. Okay, try to sum it up here relatively quickly. In the current conjunction the way I analyze it as material, institutional, spatial, and discursive sort of moments. So you can kind of look at it from the banking sector. At the level of Mexican capitalism then, state restructuring and the class reformation that has gone along the sort of reorganization around finance-led has to some extent solidified in this model, which means that the Mexican political economy is more directly exposed to flows of capital in Mexico, and they're dependent on it to a large extent because the majority of profits from the large foreign banks in particular are derived from financing state debt. There's some change in that recently, but to the most extent, that's what it is. The other material sort of consideration that there is much greater influence of foreign bank capital in the domestic power bloc. We can talk about some specific examples out later if you have questions, but it's also linked to you can also see links to the North American Security Pact in terms of the presence of global banks in that agreement and as managers, but also the effect of the power bloc in terms of trying to crush unions in Mexico and supporting the Calderon government. At the material level, the banking sector is the most centralized and concentrated Mexico has ever seen. It's dominated by financial conglomerates. These conglomerates are also in virtually every aspect of finance in Mexico, from banking to insurance to asset and fund management to brokerage to pension fund management. Mexican banks are now as profitable, more profitable than most OECD banks, and more profitable than the advanced industrialized countries. In 2005, they're looking at about a 2.7% return on assets, which is at least, well, probably 50% higher than most advanced industrialized countries. And they celebrate this from the reduced employment and branch closures. And the profits flow heavily from state securities, debt financing, but also collecting commissions. What this means for everybody else in Mexico, popular classes, is that they're also more subject to this. They're not getting loans. The small and medium-sized enterprises have been starved of credit, and those who have no access to banking will not have access, and they're completely left out, are now subject to the whims of microfinance, whatever that might mean in Mexico. It's a complete failure. And Walmart has even taken it on to some extent to sort of absorb that small aspect of banking in Mexico. Some resistance has been evident. Most people, however, there's no systematic organization against banks. El Barzón was one example of a debtors movement post-crisis, but it's not done much of recent. And there was in Oaxaca Commune some directed attacks against the banks and bank bombings, but again, nothing systematic and no real alternatives. I'm going to try to race through the rest here. Institutionally, definitely you see the internationalization of the state apparatus, so that the state has internalized commitments and the capacity, more or less, for its servicing debt, the capacity to contain and manage local financial crises. They've enabled capital accumulation, both for foreign and domestic capital alike, at home and abroad. It means a centralization of political power around financial apparatus and even tighter state market relations. This is not a case of transnationalization. These are all organized on bilateral agreements, memorandums of understanding in terms of bank supervision. There's no sort of overarching out-of-the-country apparatus. It's quite welcome within Mexico, and Calderon is enabling this. And as well, the financial apparatus, Calderon's cabal, are moving very aggressively towards complying with Basel 25 core principles, for example, on what good banking is and trying to work towards that. Now, IMF's largest concern of recent is that Mexico still necessarily hasn't quite reached, and quote unquote, an efficient resolution process in the case of the failure of a foreign-owned financial bank group. So they anticipate crisis. It's very much internalized within the apparatus, and they expect it to happen. But they're certainly, as ready as can be, or trying to be as ready as that. So it's not necessarily that they're in crisis, but they expect it to happen. Spatially, finance-led accumulation has secured Mexico's position as a peripheral emerging market and is more of a staging post of capital that can come in and out as quickly as it likes. Internally, domestically, there's a deep north-south regional divide that persists, and the continued dominance of the three city regions, Mexico, Guadalajara, and Monterrey. The major banks have done nothing to mitigate this, but they focus their resources within those regions, and uneven developmental patterns continue in Mexico. Discursively, there's a deepened discourse around the need to be individually and nationally competitive, and that state agencies in the sector of banking are committed to combating the culture of no payment, particularly focused on the individuals, sometimes looking at, concern with big capital that has not paid their debts. Ortiz in the mid-1990s said he announced a project of creating a society of micro-savers, and this is well underway. And democratization of bank capital, which was the argument behind privatization, has been replaced by a new discourse of democratization of access. So you get microfinance, you get Walmart in towns. It's done nothing to help. Calderon finds himself in this situation. There are some tensions between the state and big capital, to be sure, especially over the high interest rates that they're charging, the commissions that they're charging. There's a bit of a showdown last fall between the central bank, Ortiz, again, who threatened to impose limits on user fees and credit card limits, and has sort of been complaining about the lack of local ownership in global banks. Having resigned his position, he immediately got hired at Citibank. Now, in the campaigns leading up to Calderon's fraudulent election, banking continues to be a major issue, especially around the issues of the rescue from 1994 that continue to play out and are a massive burden on Mexican finances. And even on the side of López Obrador, there was a sort of campaign. I couldn't get much information on, but Banqueros por López Obrador, so bank workers for López Obrador, sort of organizing around this, the problem of banking rescues. So I'm going to end with the question, is finance-led capital accumulation in crisis in Mexico from the vantage point of banking? Certainly there are localized crises. There's problems with the sort of being more directly linked to global financial flows. So yes, there are some crises, particularly in the case of poverty. But judged from the capacity to pursue a meaningful alternative, there is no sense in crisis, I don't think. And on all levels, material, institutional, spatial, discursive, have crystallized around finance-led accumulation. It's very unlikely in the current conjuncture that even if, for example, López Obrador had gotten in office, that he could make a significant deviation from the current trajectory in terms of dominance of given the dominance of foreign capital, without massive political commitment and very serious economic restructuring. And any reform would have to be prepared for a very savage banking response if they decide to take them on. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but it would require massive political commitments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. After that excellent presentation, we look to the next graph very soon. We'll now turn to Dr. Martinez.